Until very recently, I worked for a company that manufactures parts for large medical equipment. For my own anonymity, I'm going to keep the details vague. All you really need to know is that I worked with big chunks of metal in a relatively small factory in the middle of nowhere. I've been in the metalworking field for quite a while at this point, and I've seen my fair share of industrial accidents over the years. I've long since come to terms with the fact that an occasional gnarly gash or painful abrasion is par for the course in my line of work. In fact, almost all of my co-workers at that factory had endured some kind of minor injury in their career. All except for one. One of my former co-workers was this guy called Lawrence. He was a loner, mid-30s, and quiet to the point of being antisocial. Although he didn't really engage with us other guys, he was pleasant enough. Never rude or anything like that, but not particularly friendly either. People still tried to joke around with him all the time, though, mainly about the fact that he seemed to never get hurt, or even react to things that should be painful. It became a running joke of sorts that he was indestructible. I think people were trying to encourage him to socialize, but it ended up annoying him more than anything else. Generally, he tolerated the joke with a wry sort of grace. There was clearly some amount of truth to the joke, though. Lawrence would regularly touch burning hot metal or chemical irritants without so much as a flinch. It was impressive what he could endure, albeit concerning. The running gag was only reinforced when, about a year ago, Lawrence had an incident with a milling machine. He was using the thing as he usually did, with no personal protective equipment whatsoever. I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but a thin hunk of metal about the size, thickness, and shape of a tortilla chip flew up from the metal sheet he was cutting and made its way directly into his eye. He didn't yell in pain, nor was there any blood. He didn't even seem concerned or freaked out about his apparent eye trauma. It turned out that he was completely fine. Not even a scratch. Apparently the shard had wedged itself perfectly between his eyeball and tear duct, miraculously avoiding cutting either his eye or face. In light of recent events, however, I'm not so sure that explanation is entirely accurate. In the following months, Lawrence became more and more careless with his work. Not that he was doing a bad job per se. The issue was that he was entirely ignoring safety guidelines. Evidently, he was always a little more lax when it came to that sort of thing, and he seemed to lack the self-preservation instincts that most people have. We would consistently remind him of the safety precautions, but he never really listened, claiming that it was easier to do the job without protective equipment. He was doing good work, so the higher-ups didn't really care if he broke a few guidelines, and nobody wanted to press the issue with him. I sincerely regret not making more of an attempt to intervene. I still struggle to wrap my head around what exactly happened to Lawrence last week. The things that I witnessed don't sound possible, even to myself. But I'll do my best to articulate the events of my last day working for the company. For the first 3/4 of my workday, absolutely nothing was amiss, or even mildly out of the ordinary. It was a Wednesday. The project I was working on was unremarkable. I was on a bit of a time crunch due to some external factors going on in my life I won't get into here, so I decided to work late so I could finish up what I was doing ahead of schedule and have a bit more free time later. Lawrence apparently also decided to work late, which wasn't surprising, as he did so somewhat often. As one might surmise based on his description, he wasn't really the type of guy to go out for some drinks with the boys. Instead of socializing, Lawrence was working a lathe. I assume the majority of people listening to this aren't very familiar with the types of machines used for large-scale metalworking. so allow me to give a highly condensed version of what exactly we're dealing with. A metal lathe is sort of like a potter's wheel for metal, a turning machine that we use to cut, sand, and face metal. They allow us to cut metal extremely efficiently and symmetrically, and Lawrence stuck his hand in one. I have no idea why exactly he did so. I can only assume it was a careless mistake. The second his hand connected with the spinning rod of metal, he yelped in shock. Lawrence and I were the only two on that side of the factory floor, and I guess that means I was the only one besides him who saw the initial impact. I braced myself to be splattered with chunks of gore as my coworker was obliterated by an industrial machine, but the rain of blood, guts, and brain matter I was expecting never came. For an infinitesimally tiny fraction of a second, I thought maybe nothing had happened at all. But then I looked back up, and my ephemeral relief was replaced by horror and confusion. There was no blood, no screaming. Lawrence only looked confused. His arm was caught around the metal rod he was cutting, but instead of being violently ripped from his body or sucking him into the machine, it was stretching. It seemed like he was made of clay, until I heard the stomach-churning pop sound of his shoulder being pulled from its socket as he stumbled forward. His arm had wrapped around the rod dozens and dozens of times, looking like a coiled spring. He had a look of panic on his face. I assume he must have been frozen in shock, but he finally started to scream. In what felt like 20 minutes, but was really only half a second, his arms seemed to run out of slack, and his body was pulled into the lathe. At least his upper half was. His legs stood in place as his torso stretched at its midsection, joining his arm in the spring-like coil. His screaming faded after a few rotations, giving way to a gurgling, retching sound. A small amount of vomit leaked from his mouth, little droplets of it landing on the floor and the walls as his upper body spun in place. At this point, I finally came to my senses and rushed to try to turn the thing off. I didn't actually have to do anything, however, because by the time my initial shock had subsided, the backed-up folds of Lawrence's skin and flesh had jammed the machine. I had no idea what to do from there. In my dazed state, I hadn't noticed the guys who were working on the other side of the factory floor had gathered around. Everyone had this look in their eyes like I'd never seen. This horrified, confused, glazed-over look only present when one witnesses something beyond comprehension. I called the police, not able to fully explain what I'd just seen. I was probably babbling incoherently. The police arrived. They called who I assume was the FBI. The FBI-looking guys called someone else. Soon enough, Lawrence's body was being unwound from the piece of steel by government officials and carried away. I thought he was dead. He was making a sound. I thought it was agonal breathing, or some sort of death rattle. But when I saw his face, I knew he was trying to speak. He was fully conscious. The image of his eyes as they made contact with mine will be laser cut into my retinas forever. Needless to say, I quit my job.